Oh, so today's session we might find is a little bit shorter than last week's session. So we'll see how we go. Um, so just to give me 2 seconds. So welcome to Interview Workshop 2. And today we're going to focus on how to combat bias during the interview process and what you can and can't ask during interview. So if we start with what is interviewer bias, so this can occur when an interviewer judges a candidate not only on their skills and their competencies, but on spoken and sometimes unconscious criteria, which will often make the interview less objective. So to give you an example, an interviewer may reject a candidate based on the fact that they didn't think the candidate had a good handshake, or that they didn't make good eye contact, or maybe because they had their arms crossed during the interview. And this kind of unconscious bias in interviewing often leads to bad hiring decisions, which leads to high turnover, which then affects culture and motivation levels across the business, and then also huge costs of rehiring. So overall, it just has a really negative impact on the efforts that employers make to bring more diversity to their workforce and to become more inclusive. So interviewer bias can show itself in lots of different ways, and as a consequence, influence the selection process. I actually have my own perfect example of this. So before I started recruiting in IT, I had many years of recruiting expertise in accounting and finance. And we launched IT as a brand new discipline for a company that I was working for back in 2010. I was part of that team, and I remember I business developed for my first IT role, which was a PHP developer. And the client gave me the brief of what he was looking for. I went out, I headhunted some candidates, I booked them in to meet that week. And I met a candidate who ticked every single box technically. However, in person, it just wasn't a great interview in my opinion. So he barely greeted me. His eye contact was poor. I remember his trousers were unironed and they had paint stains on them. I was just a little bit confused and maybe unimpressed, especially after interviewing a lot of accounting and finance candidates. But I was really hell-bent on being the first person in the team to fill an IT role. Um, so I rang the client and I explained that I'd met quite possibly the worst candidate I'd ever met in my recruitment career on a personal level, but technically I think he could do the job sleeping. So the client said, okay, book him in, let's meet him. And he went and met him the next day. And the very next day, the candidate got the job, with the client saying he was the best candidate he had ever met. So this was just such a huge learning experience for me. But there's loads of ways that we can exhibit bias as an interviewer. So if we look at stereotyping, this is when we judge someone based on their group rather than their individual characteristics. So this could be, an example of this could be that we reject a male candidate who's interviewing for a receptionist job, maybe because we believe women are more friendly, or if we rejected a woman for a job that required lots of travel because we assumed she wouldn't want to travel because she had kids. So both of these would be great examples of ignoring a very genuine candidate sitting in front of you. It could be inconsistency in questioning. So instead of asking each candidate the same or similar questions, you might adjust the questions to a candidate in a way that prevents you from getting a whole picture. So for instance, you could drill down on a candidate with a degree from a local university about the work they'd learned, and the education process there, but assume a Cambridge graduate learned everything they needed in class, so not really dig or drill too deep into their experience. It could be first impression. So you may prefer a candidate who enters really confidently and gives you a firm handshake over a candidate who maybe appears nervous and has sweaty hands or something. This is a type of first impression bias, and it can eliminate quality candidates. You might experience halo effect. So this is if the candidate, for instance, gave a really amazing TEDx talk. You might be so focused on that one thing that you judge them at being better in all areas, which wouldn't be a fair analysis. Or there's the horn effect, which is the opposite of a halo effect. And this is if the candidate scores really poorly in one area, you assume they'll do poorly in all areas. So that candidate, for instance, who has loads of spelling errors, maybe in their cover letter or their CV, but would that really matter if they're a brilliant programmer? Cultural noise. So this type of bias happens when a candidate is trying to impress you rather than share their true preferences or being the true versions of themselves. So a candidate might advocate a specific position because it's the politically correct one, but you don't end up learning anything about the candidate. So if a candidate says, oh, do you know, I'm really happy to work in the office, or I'm really happy to work from home, I really don't mind, that's fine if us as an employer don't have a stance on either of those. But if we are going to be fully working from home or fully working in the office, we really want to understand, is it something that they're going to enjoy or not? So to drill down there. Non-verbal bias. So this could be if we're judging candidates based on body language rather than skills. So this can result in rejecting neurodivergent candidates or candidates from cultures that don't have the same body language preferences as your culture. So this is something to think about. And contrast effect. So if the first candidate we interview maybe was weak, does the second candidate look extra strong? Or if the first candidate is really amazing, does the second candidate look worse when actually they're not so bad? So instead of comparing candidates to a standard, you're comparing them to each other. So something to think about. Similar to me, this type of bias is also referred to as affinity bias. So if you might feel really strongly about a candidate because you have a lot in common. So if you like the same music, went to the same school, grew up in the same neighborhood, this doesn't actually relate to their existing skills for a role or in the workplace. And lastly, central tendency. So this is a kind of bias that happens when you're holding out for a perfect candidate. So you find fault with everyone, you class everyone as kind of like middle of the road, and you keep looking for that elusive purple unicorn. So the best way to combat biases during interviews is really just to be aware of them. And this can't be achieved overnight. It does take a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. So a good start is just to help us as interviewers discover our own hidden biases. So I'd love to start with an exercise, if that's okay. And this exercise is called the Circle of Trust. Has anybody done this before? No? Okay, cool. Perfect. So I'd love you just to write down, it can be on a piece of paper, it could be on your MacBook, whichever you prefer. Write down on a sheet of paper or on a Google Docs, whichever you prefer, the initials of 6 people who you trust the most, who are not family members or your spouses. So just 6 people in your life. If you can just write down the initials of 6 people who you trust, who aren't family members or who aren't your spouse, please. And then just give me a thumbs up when you guys are done. It is a really hard one, isn't it, Matteo? If you can't come up with 6, don't worry. When I did this exercise for myself, I think I had 2. Thanks, Shirley. Are we nearly done? Okay. Perfect. All right, thank you. So now that you have your list of people, I just want you to think about the gender of those people, the nationality, the native language, age, race, ethnicity, professional background, religion of these people. And then I'd love you to place a tick beside the members of people who are in a similar dimension to you. For example, for the men amongst us, you'll place a tick beside all men in your trusted six, or any of the Caucasian participants in us will place a tick beside all of those who are also white individuals. If people are in similar professions to yours, place a tick next to those individuals, if that's okay. And how did everybody do? Did anybody here have any in your trusted circle unticked? You did, Merve? Could I ask how many of yours were unticked?
I had 5 people, but 4 of them unticked.
Amazing. Anybody else?
I had 4 people.
What was the criteria again?
Oh, sorry. I think I didn't hear that.
I was saying, I have had 4 people and 2 were unticked.
Thank you, Shirley. Were you going to say something, Matteo?
What was the criteria again? Sex, race, and
So yeah, it could be race, gender, religion, level of profession, nationality, ethnicity.
I think I have 1, but my circle is small. I have to. No,
Okay.
it's a 50-50.
Nice. Thank you. Okay, so what participants usually discover of your trusted six is that in some cases there's minimal diversity. So for a lot of participants, their inner circle include people with backgrounds similar to their own. And this tendency or preference for people like ourselves is called infinity or in-group bias and is really well researched. So studies show that in general, people extend not just greater trust, but also greater positive regard, cooperation and empathy to in-group members compared with out-group members. And this preference for people like ourselves is largely instinctive and unconscious. So affinity bias manifests not only as a preference for in-group members, but it can also manifest as an aversive tendency towards out-group members. So for example, we're more likely to withhold praise or rewards from out-group members, according to research. And then what are the implications of this for the workplace? So as leaders, when we assign responsibility for an important or high profile piece of work, who do we entrust this responsibility? We're likely to offer opportunities to those individuals who we trust the most, right? And these people, it turns out, can be people who are similar to ourselves. So how to combat bias? So if we look at bias, we've got, so if we look at bias, diversity and inclusion to start with, bias is rampant in the workplace. So race, gender, religious, age bias and hiring are all really regular issues in many workplaces. And due to human nature, we're all unintentionally biased and more skilled at hiring people who are similar to us. So if we don't put the right processes in place, this can really snowball into discriminating against qualified people and then also undermine diversity initiatives. So there's a few things that we can look at to remind ourselves of through the interview process. One of these is culture add, not culture fit. So many companies work with like a confused definition of culture fit, which does lead to bias in the hiring process and in the workplace as well. So as interviewers, we should be looking for behaviours that ensure success at Genie. Not shared hobbies, opinions, or experiences. That is great. We'd love people to have commonalities. But instead of thinking about cultural fit, it might be productive to think about culture add. A new hire may add different experiences and valuable perspectives to our team. So how are these people adding to our culture rather than fitting in? Who is in charge or who should be in charge during an interview process? So addressing hiring biases in hiring usually falls to HR, talent, or a founder. Luckily for us at Genie, we do tend to all take accountability through the interview process. And I do think this is the most effective way to reduce hiring bias and improve diversity for us all really to lead the charge. And luckily we do. So it's really important that during that interview process, we all do speak up and say our piece so that everybody's opinion is heard. And then de-biasing the stages of hiring. So structured interviews, which we'll discuss more in workshop 3, are more effective at reducing hiring bias than non-structured interviews. So scorecards and skills tests really help interviewers rank candidates more objectively. We discussed this briefly in workshop 1. The interviewers should have 15 minutes of prep before conducting their interviews. We've all been on interviews where the hiring manager is late, their head is still in their last meeting. Mostly what you then get are just really obvious questions and a decision largely based on first impressions. So we really want to use these interview kits. So an interview kit, for those of you who haven't interviewed at Genie, is essentially a preset set of questions and scores per questions for each round of our interviews. And these are created ahead of the interview with the aim that every candidate is asked and assessed on the same criteria. And this enables us to structure the way we conduct our candidate interviews. And it also ensures that candidates get the same experience and relevant when it comes to reducing bias. It helps create an equal assessment for everybody. So the content of this interview kit will differ depending on the role you're hiring for, the interview method you decide to use, and our own requirements here at Genie. But for each job, we'll have a set of questions that we ask every candidate. And that way you don't veer into similar to me bias or inconsistency in questioning. And you won't accidentally forget to ask candidate about X and then reject that candidate because X is an important skill. It's important to take notes as you go. So instead of waiting until the candidate interview ends to write down your impressions, which can then lead to similar to me bias, stereotyping, or halo or horn bias, write down your impressions as you go. So we use Team Taylor for those of you who haven't interviewed yet, but it gives you the opportunity to write your interview notes as you're performing the interview. So don't wait till the interview finishes to mull over your first impressions or to give you the opportunity to speak to other interviews on the panel. Please get your notes down before you speak to anyone else. And then grade candidates on a rubric. So before we begin the interview process at Genie, we do determine which skills are essential and we look at those skills individually. So I encourage you as part of the interview panel to speak to the line manager about this who's hiring for the role, or if you're the hiring manager of this role, share this information with the interview panel. And this will really help you avoid stereotyping, first impression bias, and contrast effect, amongst others. So how can we reduce our own personal bias? So unlearning unconscious biases can be quite a complex process. We first need to become aware of what biases we carry in order to change them. So there's lots of exercises you can do this. If anyone is interested in doing a simple exercise or running some tests, let me know and I can direct you to some really useful and insightful links. So just keep me posted after the chat. But our implicit biases are often at odds with the values that we hold. And this makes them really difficult to not just identify, but also to confront. Acknowledging that everyone has implicit biases and makes unconscious associations can feel discouraging, but it shouldn't be. Everyone also has the capacity to unlearn these biases and change their behaviours if they would like to. So the first step is to just start paying attention to our behaviours, investigating the unconscious thoughts that drive them. So you might want to do a bit of introspection, taking time to reflect on your thoughts and your actions, helping you to discover and recognise your own biases. Being mindful, mind your stress, practice self-care so that in moments of stress and pressure, you're better equipped to maintain composure and deliberate about your actions and your words. Take time to take perspective. So make time to consider and learn about perspectives that may be different from your own. Commit to improving your empathy skills. Listen carefully when people discuss their experiences with you. Expand your frame of reference by engaging with different media, different groups of people with an open mind. And then learn to slow down. Take a breath, pause for a moment to reflect before you speak or act. And over time, this will help minimize reflexive responses that stem from unconscious bias. Could be useful to check your messaging, so analysing the way your team or Genie in general talk about diversity and difference. I think we're quite good at that here, but you know, it is useful just to keep an eye on it and to check in with people every now and then. You know, is it tokenized? Is it overly optimistic? Looking at our language when it comes to diversity. Looking at how we do promote diversity, equity, inclusion here. You know, what policies are in place here to reduce bias when it comes to hiring and promotions, and are there standards and transparency around assessments used to rate job applicants and employee performance? So when you're going through the interview process yourself, it might be that you think that we could improve something or do something differently, or to make it an even fairer process. Please speak up and I encourage all of you to share your opinions and your thoughts there. Biases don't go away overnight, and there's always going to be more work to do. So just addressing your individual and personal bias is an important starting point, but please don't feel huge amounts of pressure to make huge changes. So what can we and can we not ask at interview? So any question that asks a candidate to reveal information about their national origin, their citizenship, their age, their marital status, disabilities, arrest or conviction record, and then military discharges, which I didn't know about, that's a new one for me, is a violation, so should be avoided. So really tread carefully when it comes to questions around any of these points. In all fairness, I usually cover these types of questions myself in the first round of interview. So if you're unsure, just sense check with me first, but just be really careful with these types of questions. But it could be that actually we do need to know the answers to some of these questions, like, is the candidate a UK citizen? Because we need to know what working rights they have here. Do you know, we might need to know if the candidate does have disabilities, how we can make their work life better for them. So we need to do a bit more, you know, information gathering. So there are some ways to ask for questions differently, or in a more legal way. So instead of asking, are you a UK citizen? You might want to ask, are you legally authorised to work in the UK? Instead of asking, what religion do you practice, or what religious holidays do you observe? Are you available to work within our required schedule? Do you have any disabilities? Are you able to perform the specific duties of this position? How old are you? What year did you graduate? Are you over the age of 18? So there's lots of different loopholes around this. But if you want any more clarity on this, please let me know. But in most instances, I would have covered these questions in the interview process. And that is actually it today. So just a much shorter session than last week. Does anybody have any questions? Go for it, Neil.
How do you sort of walk the line of this? It's not directly, I guess, not directly related, but say you're interviewing a candidate and you personally, like, it's not someone that you would want to directly work with, but like, how do you keep, I know that's not really biased, maybe it is slightly biased, but you know that they'd be really good at the job and they'd probably be fine and people would get on with them. Like, but at the same time, I think it's important for you to like the candidate that you're employing because you want them to fit in with the team. Like, I just think it's a really difficult thing. And I know that using the interview packs and everything is really helpful. But how would you decide that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. This idea of likability and, how and is it important in the working environment when there are so many other factors at play. I think for me, and I'm not sure if this is correct, but for me, I would say, first thing I'd ask myself is the candidate working in my team or not in my team? I think that would really affect the way I assessed the candidate. So I think it'd be more important if they were working directly with me, but it could be that actually the team they work in, they're very much liked. But also, I think during an interview process, you get such a short snippet of time with that candidate. And most of the time, the candidate isn't being the true version of themselves. They've put on an interview persona. They want to give the best versions of themselves. They're nervous. They feel under pressure. They're under huge time constraints within that hour to present an amazing version of themselves. So I almost wonder if actually that is a great representation of how likable that person is. So I tend not to assess likability too much, but you tend to know, don't you, whether someone is likable or not quite instantly for you. But yeah, it's a really challenging one. I think there's loads of factors at play, and I don't think there's a right answer or one size fits all solution, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky for some of the interviewing that I've done at Genie, because I've done a few, and you want to be objective, but you also do need to look at them subjectively as well, because it's not just what they are on paper, it is also who they are and how they interact. But I find it a lot harder than I thought I would before the interview. That's probably the hardest thing. I think it's quite easy to assess their technical skills and their answers, but kind of the nuances of their personality, I think is really hard to gauge in 1 hour.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Did you have a question, Daniele?
Yeah, thanks for this session. Very, very, very interesting, and probably not related to the hiring process, but I've been studying how to mitigate biases as a line manager, probably all my life. As it's quite difficult to, as you said, work on this, but as a line manager, it's quite important to not have any biases while you work with people, because the interview process is 2 days, 3 days, and that's it. But what's really matters is after the candidate got hired. If you still have biases, that is really dangerous. So I had to work on this, not as a part of the hiring process. But well, a similar question that's asked just now, Neil, is related to, yeah, how to identify a bias, because I think I have rejected many people that's I have at Genie that's, in my opinion, were not a match in terms of even communication style, like interview process with people that's, okay, can you briefly introduce yourself, or can you just explain this? And they talk for 20 minutes non-stop. I don't think that they were could have been a match for the team. So I think that is a, maybe we are doing this at Genie, but I think it's quite important to, as a team, to have an agreement on what we want in terms of a candidate, to reduce the biases as much as possible before the interview process starts. What do you think?
Yeah,
And are we doing this at Genie?
yeah, I completely agree. What we do is, so for every role we have like a kickoff meeting. So I'll sit with the line manager or managers and discuss more so around what we definitely nut out is like skills that we're looking for. So it's essential that this person has at least 5 years experience with X, Y, and Z. But what we don't really nut out, I suppose, or hold ourselves accountable for, is like values and personal attributes. You know, what are the non-negotiables there? So we could actually, I think that's a really great point, Daniele. We could really do a lot more work there and make sure that's consistent throughout the hiring process as well. But also in terms of what we're looking for in general, what does great talent look like at Genie across all of our roles, right? So what are those personal attributes and those skills that are going to be consistent through all of our roles? And, you know, that's what great looks like, and that's what we should be meeting for every hire. So we could definitely do some work there. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, so it's me again. And regarding the trust, well, I don't know you guys, but at least for me, I use two completely different criteria when it's come to trust. Trust in life, for me, I use different criteria for trust people in life and trust people at work. Of course, in life, I'm quite strict, so I counted just three person I really, really trust on, but we are talking about who trust in life. But at work, I use a completely different criterias. For instance, even in a startup, I tend to trust people who are able to learn fast, or they have experience, or they have a track record. And this is enough. If they don't have track record, but they can learn fast, that why not trust them? I mean, they will find a way to figure it out. But I don't use the same criteria. And by the way, it's not the criteria I use for myself. This could be actually an interesting session, how we should build the trust at the Genie, because it was one of the points mentioned in so many management book, research in many other companies. This has been identified one of the key points to improve the performance in a team. What are the criteria we use to establish trust? It could be really, really a great session that might even improve the way we delegate tasks at the Genie. That's at the moment is quite a result of personal opinions, maybe.
Yeah, what a great idea. I hadn't thought about it like that. Yeah, that's a really great workshop idea. Maybe for like a knowledge sharing day or something. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to discuss? Matteo?
Yeah, just to extend on the first question or the first point by Daniele, I think the way I think about that, but also in my experience interviewing, and you touched a bit on this, if you don't have a collective or a structure around the interview, or if you haven't discussed with the team the values you are looking for, I think personal bias and personal individual values will prevail. So yeah, and this has happened to me as well. Like if the interview structure is vague, or you are just starting looking for a new role, right? And it's up to you. Like, of course, my instincts and biases will prevail there, because I will look for my similarities. And I think a way to combat that is, and as I said before, we touched about that, it's like to have like a structure and like values we agree as a company, I guess. But even that, I don't think you can eradicate biases. Like there will be company biases as well. Like, but at some, I think it's human nature in a way. And okay, maybe it's a bit a devil's advocate, but they are there for a reason. And sometimes they can be positive, I think, but for the most part, yes, what you discussed previously, I agree, like that you can overlook candidates based on that. But sometimes I think, I don't know, maybe it's just me, it's human nature. Like I have a gut feeling, sometimes I cannot explain, but for the most part in my life, my gut feeling is right. Maybe I'm wrong. Sometimes I'm wrong, of course, but and also to what Neil said, I think even when we try to be rational, right, we tend to think, oh, even in the society nowadays, we are like, oh, we are rational, we are data based. Still, at the deep core, we are emotional creatures, and it's very hard to undo that. Yeah, but yeah, great one, great topic.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Thank you for sharing. I think because of that, your last point about us being emotional creatures, I think this is why it's important that we do take some accountability and we do like sense check with each other, because biases will creep in. But again, also, yeah, in some extent, biases are important too. Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you so much, guys. I will see you in. Oh, sorry, Alex.
So I just had a question around culture ad. I think it's a fantastic concept, and I wondered whether we could quantify it. We have this new culture deck. Ideally, the culture questions at the culture round should reflect the new culture deck, but how do we know where culture ad is in line with where we want it to be, unless we can objectively say, this is where we think the company is so far today, you know, like we're 7 out of 10 on this point of the culture deck, we're 5 out of 10 at this point in the culture deck, and then we interview someone who's actually, maybe they're not as fantastic in some areas, but they're a 10 in both of those. Is that how we define culture ad if we want to quantify it? Or, you know, leaning into what Matteo says, is it quite difficult because it's quite an emotional thing?
Did you want to go, Daniele? I don't know if you wanted to respond to Alex or.
Maybe after you.
Okay. Yeah, that's such a great question. I still think there's loads of work to do here. So this is so pertinent to Genie right now, Alex. So we've been waiting for the culture deck to be finalized so that we can overhaul all of our culture round interviews going forward. So what we'll do is we will have for every single role at Genie at cultural round, we'll have a set of questions aligned to our values and questions aligned to our culture that do not change, and then specific questions by role type. So every culture interview will have job specific culture and value questions, and then company generic culture and value questions. But Rafi's really keen to take it one step further and is currently creating a culture assessment. It's like a creation of his own. I'm just waiting for more detail on it, but this will collide with our standard cultural round to really one, help us secure the very best cultural and values fit at interview stage, but also hopefully provide us with lots of information about how this candidate can best be progressed at Genie as well. But yeah, I really like your idea. I think we could definitely do some workshops as well, Alex, around what that ad actually looks like. But yeah, this is something we're talking about lots and lots of work to do still.
Yeah, thanks. I can go next. Great question, Alex. Well, I believe this is where we, as a Genie employees can collaborate together to identify if there is any trait that could be interesting for Genie, but is not covered as a part of our current culture deck. I don't have an answer. I just I'm used to exploring the candidate skills and ability with a more holistic way, let's say, rather than just, okay, this is the culture deck. Let's see if you fit in, No, bye. Well, we don't have to do this. As an example, I can provide back in 2015, I had a candidate that was unable to speak. Literally, he was even not happy to have a talk with other candidates. And he said this in the interview process. Nah, I don't like to have a conversation. Good. And he also said that he doesn't like to be managed. And what else? Managed. And he doesn't like to work on Friday. So if I'm forced to do this, I will be attending the office, but I don't like it. But he had a super incredible, and he was affected by depression. Just to conclude the picture. So he was definitely not a culture fit, but he had an incredible skill, learning. He was unbelievable. He basically was able to learn the whole machine learning library called TensorFlow in the last 3 months. That is something that we as a company were trying to study for much more than 3 months. I reported this to the CEO and I said, I believe that this guy has an incredible learning skill that we don't have. I don't know how is it possible, but I'm sure that this guy is able to explain how to learn machine learning much faster than us. That is my feeling. We hired this guy, and a few months later, we had to promote this guy as a team lead in the machine learning team. And now he works for a company that has a 1 billion evaluation as a head of machine learning team. That was an incredible culture we had. I had to talk the responsibility to hire this guy in the end. So my suggestion is just to have a more holistic approach, talk with the team, and give more chances to people rather than just comparing them with a static culture deck document.
Oh, yeah, amazing. Thank you for sharing. All right. Well, thank you. Oh, sorry, you go, Matteo.
I assume we have more time, or are we?
Yeah, no, please, we do.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, another point you made me think was when you mentioned earlier about comparing candidates to each other rather to the standard. And I think this is interesting. I'm not sure what my question is, but so in my experience here, like at the start, I was very aware of this. Like in principle, I was aware that you should compare people against the standard, right? But then after some time, what ended up happening was that, okay, so you have this pool of candidates this round, and you start comparing them to each other. So, and now my question is, it didn't feel wrong to do this, but hearing that it is a bias, I want to discuss it. What do you feel like?
Yeah, no, great. It's a great point. I think it really depends if the standard of what you're getting is market dependent or not. So if you're interviewing what we perceive to be a lower standard of candidate technically across the board, it's likely to be like a market driven reason. So it could be that it's definitely like a candidate driven market rather than an employer one. So there's just not many candidates around. Most people aren't looking, or it could be that we aren't paying enough salary, or our offering is terrible, or our interview process is terrible, for instance. And in those cases, I think you do have to compare then by candidate. So it's quite situation specific, but I think if we're in a great candidate, we've got optimum conditions to hire great people, then we must always interview by standard.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, okay, it makes sense. Like that's how I also do rationalize it. It's situation based, I guess. It's like a trade-off. Like, do you need to really hire a person at this time, or can you afford to like keep looking, I guess?
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone's contributions also. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.